Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Tech Conversations series at Ripple, and we're happy to have Stephen Larrick here with us. And so let me introduce Stephen, then we'll get started. And as always, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll save some time at the end to address them. So Stephen is a fellow at the Technology and Public Purpose Project at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School of Public Policy. Stephen is an urbanist and an open government advocate, and we're going to talk about what both of those things mean in the context of smart city projects and also what people are calling platform urbanism. We'll unpack that term as well. Stephen has worked in city government at an urban tech startup that he ran and at nonprofits, and he has spent his whole career helping local governments work with data, civic data, develop transparency policies and best practices for community-centered data engagement. So we want in this conversation to address how cities are adopting tech and especially data analytics. What should concern us from the perspective of citizen rights and democratic control? What should encourage us? And what sorts of law and policy reforms, recognizing that Stephen's not a lawyer, but might mitigate our concerns and accelerate the benefits of technology in the public sphere. So Stephen, let's just start with a broad overview of what you see cities moving most quickly on in terms of tech adoption.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen, and thank you for having me. So in terms of how technology is really permeating multiple aspects of local government, I think there are a few vectors that we can consider. The first is the ways in which government, democratic government, as responsive to feedback from civil society itself is adopting technological processes. And this is the field that we've seen sort of defined as public or as civic tech. Governments are as are all organizations, adopting and modernizing their IT systems, adopting new technologies. And this can range from the more mundane of governments beginning to use social media or more modern cloud-based software to kind of more advanced governments adopting bringing on internal data teams, participating in analytical practices, or even deploying hardware sensor technologies, things like this. And then the third is how kind of private sector technologies and the ecosystem, the technology ecosystem that exists outside of government is impacting democratic institutions or kind of public governments and kind of the communities, especially in a place-based context, like an urban community. And so those are three different ways that I think about these. And as you mentioned, my focus of late has been on that third category, on how digital platforms, particularly digital platforms, focused in the city, are impacting the ways in which both data and the city itself is managed.
An example of civic tech, because I think people have different understandings of what that means.
Yeah, so I think for that kind of community side of things, there's some applications out there where like Nextdoor or 311, where community members are self-organizing or reporting information either to each other. So in the case of Nextdoor, people sharing information, maybe exchanging, tips, recommendations, sometimes goods or services with each other, but in kind of a way that's focused on community. Or with something like a 311 application, something like See-Click-Fix. That's an application that the government doesn't need to purchase, but that citizens can use to say, hey, there's a pothole here, or hey, there's litter in the park. There's a mattress on this block that needs to be picked up. And government can choose to utilize that platform or not, but the platform elevates the voices of its users in a way that's supposed to be targeted towards a government audience.
And I think, the Nextdoor example is so interesting because I think, one of the through lines of our conversation will be how everything that's good is also scary, right? And these things are all intertwined. And so, one of the things I see most frequently on Nextdoor are kind of Ring or Nest video of, people doing bad things on people's stoops, taking their packages or ripping up their flowers. And of course, we know that some of this surveillance video, which is privately captured, right, is then sometimes shared with the police. And it is at the same time both empowering for citizens and also can become part of a sort of surveillance web that is concerning. And so I wonder if, and that leads me to ask you kind of, I think what people are most familiar with are some of the surveillance technologies and some of the predictive analytics that particularly police departments have been using. How much is that, how prevalent is that, I guess, and how much is that concern kind of, it's very newsworthy, but it's not, it shouldn't actually, doesn't really characterize generally urban use of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think urban use of technology is a broad category. One of the trends that I think you're touching on is this, surveillance capitalism. I think is a term that I'll imperfect as it is, one that I'll use because I think it's one that folks in the audience will recognize. I think back to this idea that extractive or technologies that are capturing data from our personal data exhaust or from community sources, they're out there, they're omnipresent. And one of the things I've been looking at is how can local government agencies choose, how can they react to this changing ecosystem? So I think at the macro level, there's this trend of, when I first started out in my career, I was primarily focused on government data and how can greater access to government information bring about greater transparency, accountability for government institutions, and collaboration or feedback loops between governments and their publics. But increasingly, having worked on sort of the city hall side of things, there's been this imbalance as data generative or data capturing technologies have become more prevalent. The amount of data that is in government hands, I think, has become asymmetrically smaller than kind of the proportion of civic data that might be relevant to a community that is actually captured in private sources. And I think governments can choose to. They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place when I talk to city officials when they think about what to do about that, because I think they are kind of feeling like, either we can sort of stick our heads in the sand and say, hey, this is an invasive kind of approach, capturing data about people, this level of fine-grained information. That's not something that we as a publicly accountable institution should do. But what that means is there's a power imbalance between public and private sector. And also maybe a less of an ability for government to provide the types of digital services that we as digital consumers have become accustomed to. And then on the other side of things, there's kind of this risk that government says, okay, we're going to adopt these practices too. We didn't kind of create the rules of the game. Maybe they're flawed, but we're going to jump in. We're going to collect really detailed information, or we're going to require private companies share really detailed information with us. And we're going to become, data centric as well. And I think, to me, all this relates back to this concept that kind of, I think, first maybe expressed or at least popularized by Tim O'Reilly in a paper in 2011, was this idea of government as a platform. And later, the Aspen Institute in 2015 or 2016 held a conference and put out a report on the city as a platform. And I think one of the things I think a lot about is, if the city is truly a platform, it's going to need to, in operating that way, of course, it's going to strive to collect more and more information to kind of operate and model itself after these types of technologies. And there's good and bad in that. But an interesting corollary that I think a lot about is if government is a platform, we have to also think about platforms as governments. And so one of the big topics I've been focused on has been how are digital platforms kind of seizing parts of domains or shifting paradigms in terms of the types of services that we've traditionally associated with public agencies, or the types of decisions and rulemaking that we've associated with public agencies. And so to what extent is this idea of sovereignty being problematized, at least, through kind of this competition almost between the rule setting and information gathering legitimacy of a platform that can even speak directly to its constituents. We've seen with like Airbnb lobbying its users to come out a certain way on a policy referendum, and governments themselves. And so I think we have these kind of two types of risks. The first is what you mentioned. There's this risk that as government becomes more. Oh yeah, sorry.
Before we get to this, I want to pause and hold on government as a platform, city as a platform. O'Reilly's words, and then Sarah Burns has a great book called City as a Platform, I think. And so let's talk a little bit about what that means. Then I want to get to, I mean, in this moment when we're seeing how platforms and tech in general is reacting to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can certainly see how the platforms are kind of acting as if they are countries, exercising kind of sovereignty. But the first one, government as platform, may be less familiar to people. So what does that mean?
Yeah, I think the idea there is that, my background, I kind of come from a government transparency background. And I think at the time in the early 2010s, this was sort of a pre-techlash era. There was sort of this idea that if we publish data, it can enable software development on that data in ways that can build almost an open source ecosystem of tools that communities and governments alike can use to improve feedback loops, to create efficiencies, accountability, collaboration within government. And so the idea was almost in the same way that the Apple App Store is a platform for a number of different apps. The government itself could release could open up its information systems through data publication. And I think O'Reilly in particular was interested in open APIs that could enable software development on top of sort of this government infrastructure.
So just an example of that, and in the photo over my shoulder, you see the city of Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia has lots of vacant lots. So one idea would be, let's publish all the information we have about city-owned vacant property, including things like, traffic patterns and density around it and everything, all, licensing and everything we have. And then that will help the private sector to determine where they might want to buy property and how they might want to develop it, and how to make the best use of empty vacant lots. That would be one example. Right?
I think that's a great example. And in fact, in 2014, when I was working in a city hall in Rhode Island, the city of Central Falls, we worked with a startup called Opportunity Space, and very similarly, we published an open a map and an open data set of our vacant properties, as well as our tax liened properties, and prompted our community groups to kind of let us know if they had ideas on how to use them.
Great. Okay. So that's government or city as a platform. And what are some of the risks to that? What have been some of the post-techlash critiques of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ways in which platforms operate can be extractive. And I think a lot of what we think of as platforms are sort of these two-sided marketplaces that connect a consumer market to a market of goods or services. And, I think there are lots of ways in which governments can play government as platform can be very valuable in providing that role. But I think some of the risks associated with government as a platform is adopting some of the survey, the types of approaches that we've come to define as surveillance capitalism. Whether that is asking communities to do work that really should be funded publicly, whether that is outsourcing, similarly outsourcing to a vendor or to another kind of external group, something that should be functioning as a core government service, or whether that's actually just building the kind of fundamental elements of a surveillance state, right? I mean, I think collecting fine-grained user data is something that does have risks associated with it. And, I think one thing I want to caution as someone who worked in community housing, governments have long collected very detailed information, but sort of on the scale, the big data scale that platforms aspire to, is maybe something that not all of the governments that I've worked with necessarily have the technical capacity to kind of get there right away. And so there may be risks in terms of both cybersecurity, data leaks, but also just frankly in terms of power and of access. A key difference between a private company and a government is, a government inherently has power. The power of state violence and the police force or the criminal justice system is a very different kind of power than the market power of a private actor.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up security, and I think from my perspective, I can just add that here that when people talk about the dangers of government as a platform, sometimes the critique is really more about neoliberal critique of where government power is gone and sort of austerity and the fact that public services are not funded in the way that they should be. And then that leaks into a critique of the tech arrangement. And so if I can just run down the list, the risks of government, nobody is, for decades, people were complaining that governments are not sufficiently data driven, right? That they do not collect enough data, they do not release enough data, they do not use data in a sensible way. And so I think the critique of government as a platform is not about smart use of data. It is, as you said, paradigmatic tech platforms gather more data than they need, right? So they have this sort of maximalist perspective. We're concerned about the city doing that, especially because they have police power. We're concerned about it being brittle and sort of, susceptible to cyber attack, and also in some ways capture by the private vendors. And I think that goes to a general concern about privatization. So it's sort of a gloss of privatization on top of the city as a platform, which very much lends itself to that. And then, I think that there's another part of the critique, which is a concern that the city will stop acting in the public interest and just move towards a kind of frictionless efficiency in the way that platforms do. And so some of the services, I think maybe even O'Reilly talks about this, is, okay, we can imagine it turns everything to sort of as a service, right? Housing as a service, transportation as a service, all provided on top of this this app or this platform with open APIs that makes it all possible. But sometimes we don't want friction-free or the most efficient solution. We want equitable solutions, or we want public serving solutions. So there can be, in some ways, I think there's no reason why city as a platform couldn't incorporate those values, but we haven't seen that done in the private space. So there's this fear. And then the last concern, I think implicit in what you said about too much data gathering is also, and I think you also called it, data leaks, is that there can be internal leaks. So data sharing within government that, if we're collecting data about housing and we're collecting criminal, sort of police data, and we've got health data and we've got educational data. Traditionally, I think government's been very careful about keeping that separate. And so city as a platform encourages them, right, to blend it all together so that it is most useful for sort of data analytics.
Potentially. And I think, I think this area of internal data governance is an important, I think developing space where best practices are emerging. And I think for some sectors are ahead of others. For a long time, public health agencies have been gathering very sensitive information, including from private organizations like hospitals, and they have clear practices for firewalling and protecting that data.
Stephen, I think you and I probably both come from a place of critique, right? We're critical of some of these practices and concerned about some of the risks. And I think that's mostly what, the media has been focused on as we hear, stories about Palantir and other kinds of extractive facial recognition. And do we sort of see this boomerang like in the city of San Francisco, where it first says, it's not going to use facial recognition. It has a ban on it, and then it tries to walk that back because it sees, well, actually, it would be crazy if we didn't use it in these circumstances. I forgot what it was it lost children? And so you see this kind of ricocheting between the positive use case and the excessive use case. So I wonder if you have any candidates for sort of positive use cases of tech or data analytics or sensor networks.
Yeah, I think it's such a broad category. And as mentioned, I've been primarily focused of late on I think that this notion of how are cities interfacing with private platforms that are collecting data that could be needed to carry out a regulatory or other core public function, or that could be potentially beneficial if shared for research purposes or planning purposes, et cetera. But I think there are many examples of government use of data that are unequivocally positive. They're open source projects like OpenAQ, where folks are collecting air quality data and kind of publishing those via community installed sensors to an open API that governments are using to kind of keep track of air quality. There are examples of data exchange, whether that's through standards like GTFS, the way that kind of public transit schedules appear on your route planning apps. There are ways in which just simply by better structuring and publishing their own data, we all are able to kind of better keep track of government. And I think we can think about that as simply or straightforwardly as the publication of core data that's relevant to accountability, like budget or like officer use of force, this type of thing. I think all of those things are relatively straightforwardly good. And I think you mentioned the critical lens that I often bring to this work. It's funny, I can feel almost schizophrenic because I wear these two hats. I have both worked in government, working on kind of bringing more empirical practices to the work of say city planning or housing. I've worked with a lot of governments trying to encourage data publication. And I actually worked at an urban technology company as well. And again, trying to build something that can serve the public interest, but from that kind of private sector vantage point. And I think just one of the trends that's important to name that I've been looking at is sort of the platformization of everything. And in particular, at my last job working at an urban tech startup, the set of incentives that startups need to appeal to in terms of getting venture capital are ones where you're really incentivized to make what's called a platform play. And it may be that you have a set of use cases that are narrowly tailored and would require a data minimization approach. But to be able to make this kind of argument that you're going to aggregate massive amounts of data and then make those available as some sort of civic platform, that kind of increases what in the venture space they call your TAM, your total addressable market. And it means that you can kind of get to a higher projection in terms of what your valuation might be. And so, one of the things that we've seen is almost all urban technologies are kind of using this rhetoric of platform in some way, and using this rhetoric of kind of the data as an asset or a valuable part of a platform. And so I think one of these areas that I've started to scrutinize is, what does that mean when all of these technologies that are focused on kind of the civic space are building platforms and setting their own rules, and potentially doing so in a way that can have implications for labor markets, for consumer protections, depending on the good and service, for mobility, for environmental issues, and also just for kind of core issues of private sector surveillance. And what's the role of government in kind of the oversight of that, in collaborating with that, but also potentially in kind of making sure that there's a level playing field, or there's some level of protection. And so some of that can, my focus has been on data sharing, and that can play a large role. And there are other protections that I think need to play a role as well.
I really want to talk more about that, and I also want to hear about your project that you're working on right now, because I think for all of our benefit, you are actually doing the hard work of gathering these local contracts with vendors or licenses. So, for example, when any city allows Lime or another sort of rideshare entity to use its rights of way, it enters into a license agreement, and that might cover data and other these practices. So I want to hear about that project. Also, the role of venture funding for these companies, and the way in which the city is a sandbox, right, for them to kind of test out their tech. And often I think they do it for free, right? They enter into pilots where they provide the tech for free. And what they're getting is kind of the data and the proof of concept, so they can go back out on the market. And I think from a public perspective, there are very mixed and sometimes contradictory views about this. So one view is, all right, well, there's value there. So now the city as a platform basically becomes, and we, the people who live in the place, are the market, right? Or the city services are the market that they're developing and that they're selling to venture capitalists. And so one view might be, okay, well, if there's value there, the city should get some of that value. So these contracts should have sort of a revenue share for the city with respect to any kind of derivatives that are developed out of the tech. Another view is, no, we should stay very far away from any kind of business case for this tech, because that creates the wrong incentives. And these agreements should, very carefully control what happens to the data and how it's used. And so I guess, I'd encourage you just to tell us about your project, and then kind of what you're seeing in these documents.
Yeah, so what I've been looking at, and again, I think there's this, we can think about this, we've sort of been touching on this idea of the smart city. And as alluded to, we can think of the smart city as a set of technologies primarily used by governments to kind of aggregate and create a system of systems, centralized data on a set of dashboards in a control room that are powered by sensors and software systems that are all kind of controlled by government. But kind of another, and in some ways underexplored, part of this idea of the smart city is this notion of platform urbanism. And what that's looking at is sort of the ways in which private platforms that operate in cities have fundamentally shifted some of the paradigms, or kind of impacted things like labor markets, the ways in which we access goods and services, the ways in which we get around and plan our days. So, it might mean that when we get up, we're using Google Maps or transit app, and it's telling us what our route is. Or we're using a platform like Waze to let us know about traffic patterns, or where police are on our morning commute. It might mean that we're bringing up Facebook Marketplace to see, or Nextdoor to see what kinds of goods or services are available in our neighborhood. It might mean that we call a ride hail to get to work through an Uber or Lyft. It might mean that we're staying at a short-term rental like an Airbnb or VRBO, Verbo, I think they call it. And so all these different ways in which we kind of have systems of digital intermediation in terms of the ways that we kind of experience the city. And one of the interesting things is when these services first started arriving, I think again it's complicated because these are services that people like, and in many ways provided some benefit to the city. And at first there was a lot of techno-optimism about the arrival of the so-called sharing economy in cities, and but we also saw some explicit goals of what was called regulatory hacking. This idea that like, hey, we don't need to get a taxi medallion. This is a new type of thing, or we don't need to pay a hotel tax or register in a hotel registry because this is an Airbnb, it's not a hotel. And so, there's kind of been this tension and set of iterations that has kind of brought it about what I'm exploring as a new policy type that I'm calling a data sharing mandate, or a platform data sharing mandate. And in particular, when you asked about what sorts of use cases for government access to data or use of data are positive, we see things like when these services first begin appearing, there are regulatory bodies that had a job to do, and they needed data to do that job. So, for instance, in New York City, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, they had a set of laws around minimum shifts that a driver can drive. And Uber has that data on how long is an Uber driver riding in a vehicle. And at first, the Taxi and Limousine Commission didn't have access to that. And so the ability to actually enforce that regulation was severely impaired by not having access to that data. And I think by making their regulation really specifically tied to a core function of the agency, I think it kind of built a strong case for why this data collected by a private company should be shared with the Taxi and Limousine Commission in a way that allows them to kind of carry out that core function. And so now that data is shared, and part of what the TLC does with that data is make sure that essentially a labor protection is followed and enforced. Yeah. And so anyway, just one last plug. The project I've undertaken is to do a comprehensive survey, primarily focused on the United States, but looking a little bit internationally as well, for which I've collected a number of these policies. Many of these are administrative regulations, so something set out by a specific Department of Transportation or planning department, this type of thing. But many of them also have a corresponding city council ordinance and maybe a specific license or permit application that will have a section called data sharing. And I think increasingly we saw early on, these were general and maybe asking for data in a way that sounded like how you might ask a grantee for a quarterly report. Hey, you're going to share information with us on a regular basis about your listings. But we've kind of seen this sophistication evolve, where now cities are even asking for, defining an API protocol and asking for, standardized, machine readable, regularly updated data streams as a precondition for some of these platforms to even operate in the jurisdiction. And so that's something new, and I thought it was something worth scrutinizing. I think both for kind of the concerns around privacy, but also to the potential benefits to bolster a democratic defense against privatization. And so these are sort of the two sides of the coin.
Absolutely, and they really are two sides of the coin. And I'm thinking, I think there's been this real move to getting real-time information, right? So we don't want quarterly reports from Uber about where they're driving and what their traffic flow is and what areas they might not be serving and all of that. We want real-time information about what streets they're on. And there's also, one can quite easily see the move to kind of real-time enforcement, right? We don't want you on those streets. And, I'm imagining either other kinds of mobility as a service, all the way to AVs, where there's a constant data stream. And you could imagine, enforcement authorities being very interested in all the kinds of driving behavior. They don't have to wait until they get a black box, right? They can have real-time data about who's exceeding the speed limit with real-time enforcement. So it takes kind of the red light camera, sort of automated enforcement that we have now, to a whole new level. It makes it, much more, there's this term personalized law, right? So you can have enforcement and law that's tailored sort of to individual data. And I just wonder what reaction you have to that. I mean, is that a good thing? Is that is, incredibly efficient? Is it, it could be sort of, one could imagine it being anonymized and being sort of automated. So how do you view that, and how do we manage kind of the benefits and the risks of real-time data flows from the private companies to the government?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. So I think, as with a lot of this, it's important, and I think part of what I wanted to bring to the field with the Municipal Data Sharing Policy Hub, which is the name of the project. I don't know how well SEO'd it is, but yeah, if you add my name, you'll find the page on Belfer, and you'll be able to find the Municipal Data Sharing Policy Hub. Part of my goal in doing this
right now, so that we can move that up.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, part of my goal in kind of conducting this survey and of not just how scholars are talking about the kind of emergence of platform urbanism, but also what does the regulation of this look like on the ground, was to bring an empirical lens to this conversation. And so, I think for so much of this, it really depends on the use case and on what were the policy objectives, and are those policy objectives something that truly fall under the jurisdiction of the agency that's kind of making this sovereignty-based claim to data in a way. And so, I think the part of what I discovered in the literature review as one of my advisors on this project is a lawyer who's come out with a set of policy recommendations. Her name is Beatrice Botero Arcillo, and I have some recommendations that are not so different from hers. But essentially, I believe these sorts of data mandates should be sure that they're doing a few things, a few best practices. And first and foremost is defining the government objective in the use case. And so to your question about real time, some use cases require closer, more frequently updated data, and some use cases can be more static or more updated with greater gaps. And so, I worked with the city of Louisville, and they wanted to make sure that their school for the blind didn't have scooters left in the sidewalk that the visually impaired might trip over. And they felt like the timeline for making sure that type of a vehicle was cleared for the sidewalk was a matter of hours. And so to enforce that requirement that kind of they had the sovereignty to enact, they needed that. They argued that they needed that level of frequency. And I think something like that seems fair. Now, would you need that level of frequency if your goal was to make sure that, as a general rule, the number of scooters deployed was generally corresponded to the weather or something like this, or that it wasn't exceeding some number on average over the course of a month? Well, you wouldn't need real-time data for that. And so some use cases require more frequently updated data than others. And I think the next component is this idea of minimizing the data collection. So data minimization is a best practice in the data privacy world, and also just generally. And once you can't really define the minimizing data requires understanding the use case so that you can say, this is the data I need. I don't need anything more than this. And so the idea is that if you collect more than you need, that extra data creates a liability that you'll have to deal with, as well as something you need to justify. Why are you collecting more than you need? And I think that, the good news for government is, some of the use cases they might have are quite broad. So in a lot of places where governments are experimenting with data sharing, there's some sort of pilot, like a pilot scooter program. And part of their goal is to study the impacts of this program so that they can draft future legislation. And so, I think as we saw with things like Uber, there were claims made at first that this would reduce traffic, reduce emissions. And it turned out that was not true. And perhaps we would have known about it a lot sooner had data been shared. And so I think we see some governments making this claim that part of the data we need in order to create the public policy that will sort of manage how this works in the future. So again, we've got define the objective, data minimization, and then committing to transparency. What are the governments asking for? Making sure the policies are published, sort of the metadata of like what exactly is the government receiving? What's the retention? Like how is this managed? Just everything about who's responsible. All of that should really be defined and published transparently. Part and parcel of that is defining the roles and responsible actors in a way that creates accountability, as well as really ensures that there's some mechanism of making sure that there's capacity inside government, and that infrastructure for data management is there. And then finally, there's this idea of firewalling data, I think in particular against those departments that access to data is a lot more legally complicated because of things like the definition of a Fourth Amendment search, which again, I'm not a lawyer, but from my interviews with experts in the field, as well as discussions with folks who are more legally expert than I am, seeing policies that protect and firewall data against sharing with certain types of departments, that's a best practice that cities would be wise to adopt. And I think that's 5 kind of basic principles. And part of what I'm doing right now is reviewing all 70 of these, 70 plus of these policies that I've gathered, to try to see how many of them, have language that corresponds to these principles. And, for some of them, for some of these principles, I would say it's not many of them. And so part of the goal here is really just to kind of start the discussion because, this is something that's happening. This is a process of iteration. We see these policies spreading to new use cases, to new types of platforms, and to new jurisdictions. I think there's a lot of benefit here in terms of the ways that government can protect consumers, ensure labor protections, protect against environmental externalities, ensure that taxes are paid fairly, this type of thing. But we also want to make sure that we're holding governments to account for acting responsibly.
So Stephen, I have to ask, and we're in our last minute, if anyone has a question, put it in now. As a researcher and on behalf of our students, how did you get these? Were they all publicly available? Did you have to call the cities?
Yeah, so I focused on 3 primary buckets. So I do think there are emerging sets of technologies that are outside of these 3 buckets, but the sharing economy is where we've seen policy development happen most. And so I looked at TNCs, so-called ride-hail transportation network companies. I looked at short-term rental, so that's like your Airbnb. And then I also looked at micro-mobility or kind of e-scooter sharing, dockless mobility. And one of the trends that I didn't kind of get to some of the observations from the field as well, but one of the trends is that the asymmetry between global platforms or national platforms and a local government is one that I think has brought about a response, which is municipalism, networked municipalism. And so one of the places where I gathered a number of policies, particularly in the micromobility space, is through the Open Mobility Foundation, OMF, which maintains the mobility data specification, which is one of the data standards through which we've seen kind of the sharing of much more granular transportation data emerge. So they maintain a list of a number of city policies. Additionally, just as someone who's worked in the space, I was familiar with a lot of them, but it took a lot of desk research as well. And just think, kind of looking at cities, looking at news articles that had covered the emergence of new programs like e-scooters, and just checking to see if they had a policy and if that policy, used the word data anywhere. And I think it was a little bit harder to find some of the earlier sharing economy, kind of Gen 1 sharing economy policies. But I found a report that actually looked at some of the early responses to the emergence of ride hail and Uber, and it had a catalog of a number of the early city responses. And some of the things we see there are, the cities that were equipped to regulate these types of companies were those that had more leverage. It wasn't your small cities, it was the larger cities. And I think that made those policies a little bit easier to find as well.
Yeah. All right, thank you. There are two questions here. Let me just if we can go 1 minute late, I think you can answer them both. One is about how data minimization is really not in the DNA of the private companies, as you mentioned, sort of platform play. So, how do we make that? Is it enforceable? And the other one is about someone who's researching public-private partnerships in K through 12 education and noting that it can be very hard to get your hands on some of the more controversial contracts. And maybe I can answer that. I think FOIA is a mechanism you can use, but I think it's the anonymous writer is correct that it can be very difficult to sort of shake those loose. Do you want to say something about data minimization?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think it's also a little bit of a delicate balance, because if you define the use case too narrowly, then data minimization could actually impede some of the public benefit or kind of the ability of a government agency to carry out its core functions and the reason it needs the data in the first place. But if it's ill-defined and unenforceable, then we kind of have this risk of over collection of data. And kind of the liability or risks to civil liberties that might come with that. And I have not seen strong, there's not a strong bit of language I can think of in any of these policies that I've reviewed that really sets up an enforcement mechanism for data minimization. But, I think one thing that we do see in licenses, and again, this is going to get into the legal domain that's outside of my expertise, are the types of usage restrictions that might create liabilities that would create a disincentive to collect more than you need, or even just kind of the fact that you might have it could be considered a liability. I would say the other place that you could look at for minimization are things like retention schedules or retention policies. And so there are some places that are I guess related to Ellen's point about FOIA and sunshine laws. One jurisdiction I looked at was in Minneapolis. And so they were including in their kind of data sharing policy a commitment to not even collecting GPS breadcrumbs, partly because they have strong sunshine laws that would require them to make some of that public if they were to actually receive it as a government agency. And so, what you collect in the first place is that if that's defined, that accountability of being transparent about what you're collecting and not, that can be an incentive towards minimization. If you have other laws like retention laws or sunshine laws that can disincentivize over collection of data, that can also help.
Fantastic. All right, Stephen, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for having me.